Hi, this is Maya Basics 2. So in this class we're going to take a look at how to actually start animating some objects. We're going to animate our objects on the timeline and then we're going to refine it in the graph editor. Usually animation students are afraid of the graph editor. It can be quite daunting at first, but it's an extremely important tool that it must be learned when working in Maya or any other 3D software. You should use the editing tools. Professional animators use the graph editor religiously, but I know a lot of animation students, even by the time they get to third year or fourth year, they're still not using the graph editor because they're afraid of it. And it can be a little confusing at first, but because it's so important and because professional animators use it on a daily basis, I want to start you guys off getting used to it right away. Alright, so the first thing we'll do is just create a cube like we did in the last class. So we go to the Polygons tab and select the cube here. And then you can just click. We're going to scale it up or on your keyboard. Let's just scale it up a little. And we'll just bring it up so it's sitting on top of the grid. We don't have to get precise here. Look down to your timeline. To set a key, you just press the S button. You can do it other ways too, but for now we'll just press the S button. And what that will do is key all of the channels in the channel box. So take a look in the channel box and you'll see that all these channels for your all three move dimensions, all three rotate dimensions, and all three scale dimensions, and even your visibility, they've all been keyed, and you'll see that the channel or these text fields turn this pink color. That means that all these channels have a key on them. Now I'm just going to hit Control Z, hold Control and press Z to undo that. You could also key individual channels. So say I just wanted to key my Translate Y channel. You can select the name, right click, and go to Key Selected. And that'll just set one key on the Translate Y. You could also really drag over all of them and go Set Key. If you press S on your keyboard, it does the same thing. So once you've done that, looking at your timeline, you'll see this little red line appear. That red line is a keyframe. So that basically means that this cube is going to now stick to those coordinates on that frame. Now if we go down the timeline a little, let's say go to frame 40, we'll go to 25. If I hit W on my keyboard for our move tool, it's pushed in the corner here on the side. Say I move this a little bit in X, I'll move it up in Y and forward in Z. And I press S again. So now you see there's another one there, a red keyframe on frame 25. So if we drag over, or if we scrub over this now, you'll see it goes from the coordinates that we had it on at frame 1, and then we moved it a bit and set another key by pressing S, and now it goes from point A to point B, and that animates. If you want to play that, you can hit play on the right side of the timeline here. So it just goes to those two positions and then stops. You can hit this button, as we discussed in the last class, on the far left of your controls here. Shoot you right back to frame 1. You can also, if you want to play, the hotkey for playing is holding Alt down and press V on your keyboard, and you can press V again to stop it. So if you have Alt pressed down, tapping V starts and stops the animation, and then we can shoot right back to frame 1 again. So let's go to our layout. Go to this one here. Okay, so remember we created a camera last class, and we made this the camera view by going to Perspective, and then Camera 1 appears here. In this file we don't have, this is a new file, so we haven't created a camera. So let's go ahead and create a camera really quickly. Create cameras and go to Camera, and then we can drag it out in the Perspective view. I'm just going to drag it out in Z and up and Y a little bit, and then we'll make this panel our camera view. Now we have Camera 1 here. Straight out in Z, up a little in Y. So we're looking at a stage here in our camera view. Think of it as a stage, and we're looking at it in the Z axis. So we're looking directly down the Z axis. Alright, so we got our layout back here. Should have your graph editor at the bottom. So we'll select our cube again. Once you select your cube, you can see your keys in the timeline again. We'll also see them in the graph editor now. So let's take a look at the graph editor just for a minute. We can slide this up a little to see it better. So in the graph editor, there's a whole set of navigation tools that you can use as well. It's the same as in Maya, how we orbit, pan, and zoom. In the graph editor, we can do the same thing. We can pan around. We can't orbit, obviously, because this is a two-dimensional environment. There's no Z axis, but we can pan by holding Alt down. Same as in the perspective view. You can zoom in and out. If you hold Shift Alt, right-click and hold down and drag, you can scale the environment. So you're going to want to be able to do that. This is really important. You'll see why later. Let's hold Shift and Alt down, right mouse click, and then we can scale the whole environment up and down, and we can also do it right and left. Okay, so let's see what this graph editor does. So you'll see all these channels the same as we have in the channel box. the graph editor shows you all these channels on the right side here. You can also drag this in and out. So let's just focus on one at a time here. Let's practice moving something in the translate X axis. So you can see that we have what we did is we moved the cube a little bit in X, moves a little bit in X, and it moves a little bit in Z, and it also moves up in Y. So this is the representation of that movement right here. So it starts slow, it starts to speed up a little bit, and then so it eases in and it eases out. You can see that these little black dots are the keyframes, and the line, which is, we call it the curve, the animation curve, is what it's happening in between this whole section here, in between the two keyframes. So if we go to, let's go to frame 25. On the timeline, place your time marker on 25, and then in the graph editor, let's select that key. So you can just drag a box over it to select it. Now if you hold shift down and middle mouse button, you can move that key up or down. You can look in your perspective view while you're moving that key up and down, and you can see it's changing, permanently changing that animation. So you're placing that key in a different place, right? So remember we talked about the X being positive on this side and negative on this side. Well, in the graph editor, we have this 0, see where 0 is, and there's a horizontal line that goes straight through the graph editor. That's like the equator. So anything above the equator is positive, and you can see the positive numbers on the left here. Anything underneath the equator is negative numbers. So if we move it, if we move this key up into the positive area, you can see the cube going into the positive X side. And if you move the key down, shift middle mouse button, drag down, into the negative numbers, you can see it moving to the negative side of X. And we can do that on frame 1 as well. We can move any key we like. So we'll go to the rotate Y. So now when you select rotate Y, you don't see it here, but if you press F on your keyboard, it'll snap you right to it. F is for focus. By the way, you can also do that in any one of these panels as well. You can do it let's do it in the perspective view. So you want to zoom in on the box, just press F on your keyboard and it'll just bring you right to it. If we go to translate Y, we're on frame 25. If we select the key on frame 25, hold shift down and middle mouse button, you'll see that as we drag it up, it's going up in Y in the positive. If we drag it down, it's going down in Y in the negative. Also notice in the channel box as we do this, the numbers are changing in the channel box under the translate Y. As soon as you stop, you'll see the number change. So it's basically the coordinates for this box in Y. By doing it in the graph editor, you're changing it permanently. Well, not permanently, you can move these anytime. So in Z, we'll do the same thing. You can do it on frame 1 or frame 25, moving it in Z up and down. It's up and down in the graph editor, but it's back and forth in reality here, virtual reality. We didn't rotate this cube at all when we animated it. We just animated the translate values. But if I want to give it some rotation, I can select this key on frame 25 and give it some rotation. Now if we zoom in, we'll see the change as we drag this key up and down. Only moving a little bit. So what we need to do here is we need to hold shift and alt down and right mouse button, and we can scale the graph editor. We need to see a bigger change happen in that rotation, so now it's shift and middle mouse button, and we can move this keyframe up and down. So you can see why you need to scale the graph editor sometimes. So scale it down and then move that key up. So now that we've actually moved the rotation X key in the graph editor, now that we've moved it up a little bit, you see the box rotating. If we scrub over our animation in the timeline, it actually moves in X now too. It's still doing all the translations, or moving, but now it's actually rotating because we move this keyframe on rotation X. So it's moving and rotating. We can do it on rotation Y as well. And you can see that because this is flat, you'll notice when you click on these, because we didn't animate any rotation on the cube originally, basically this whole curve is flat. And when something's flat, when any curve is flat, it means there's no animation on it whatsoever, so it's not moving. There's keys set on it, but it's not moving. And then whenever you have anything, any kind of arc, anything but flat basically, there's movement on it. So we'll grab this at frame 25, or we can grab it at frame 1 even if you want to, and we can drag that down to a negative or positive, doesn't matter, just shift middle mouse button and drag it up, say, just to experiment. And you can see it's rotating in X and Y now. And then we'll do it in Z over here. You have to be on the frame to see the change in the panel. So if I'm on frame 1 and I move some keys on frame 25, I won't see it happening in any panel. But if you want to see the change, go to the frame on the timeline and then select the key, and then you can see the change as you move the key in the graph editor. So I'll slide that up. Alright. And we can do the same thing for the scale values as well. Now one thing to note, say for example, I'm just going to select my translate Y curve and scale this up. So I mentioned before that we have a keyframe on 25 and we have a keyframe on 1, and we've keyed all the channels. All these channels here are the same as all these channels here. You can select all of them, but simply by selecting the first one, hold down and drag, and you can see if you press F on your keyboard, you'll see all the curves. You can also drag out and expand them a little bit to see them a little clearer. You'll see that we have a keyframe on all these channels, from translates, all the translates and rotates. Now we have some kind of animation going on. And you can scrub over and see it from frame 1 to frame 25. Now what's happening in the middle can be changed in the graph editor. You can set a new keyframe and change the animation. Say I went somewhere in the middle and I pressed S. You'll see a new keyframe appear in the timeline, and then over in the graph editor you'll see a row of dots appear. This is the new key I just set on frame 13. You can grab those and move those too to change any one of these channels. Translate Y. So you can change in between any movement. You can set a new key to change the animation, or I'm just going to undo. So say we don't have any keyframes set in the middle, but we want to make what happens in the middle of those two keyframes different. You could bend these curves. So say I select the keyframe on frame 1. Looking in our perspective view here, when you select a keyframe, you get these handles on both sides. You can select either side. You see it turn a different color. It turns yellow. Once you have that handle selected, you can middle mouse button and just drag your mouse and it'll bend the curve. So you can see that change happening. Now I have my time marker placed in between the two keyframes that we set. You see it in the graph editor here by this represented by this red line, and then you can see it in the timeline. You can see where my time marker is just sitting on frame 12 there. So middle mouse button, bend this Bezier handle, and you can see when I bend the curve it changes the animation in between these two keyframes. You can also go to X. You can do it on any channel. Select any key, grab any handle, you can grab any side and move it. And you can see it's affecting the Translate X that I have selected over here on the left. This is the curve for Translate X. Okay, so you can do things that way as well. You can change the action. You can change the motion that's occurring in between two keyframes that way. All right, so let's go to one of our keyframes. We'll go to 25, and now that we have keys set, you can see how this step back and forward one key button works. You can see it steps from one key to the next. The hotkey for that is on your keyboard. Right in between your M key and your question mark key, there's the greater than less than keys. You can step from keyframe to keyframe that way as well. If you want to move a keyframe, you can select all the channels in the graph editor. You do it two different ways. You can select all the channels in the graph editor and zoom out a little just so you make sure you can see all of them. It's easy to miss some. Sometimes you need to scale down or zoom out or both. But you can grab all the keys by dragging a box over all the keys in the graph editor, and you can hold shift down, middle mouse button, and drag, and it'll move the entire it'll move all the channels of that keyframe. Or you can simply go into the timeline, hold shift down again, and just click on the key you want to move, and you'll see it turns red, and you can drag that key anywhere on the timeline. And then you can just click anywhere on the timeline to get rid of the red selection. If you had a bunch of keys here, well, we do have two. We can say I select frame 1, shift select frame 1, and drag over the entire timeline just so you get both keys inside the red area. And you'll see that you have an arrow on each end. You can't see it because it's on frame 1, but you'll see the arrow here, and there's an arrow on the other side as well. It's just hidden. But in the middle there's a double arrow. You can grab that double arrow and shift the entire animation over down the timeline. And you can see now the key we had on frame 1 is over here, and we've shifted the entire animation over. So you can do it just like this. And now you can see both arrows on each side. You can grab these arrows on the end and scale the animation out a little bit. I wouldn't do that. I would try and stay away from doing that, but I just want to show you that it's there. I'll just show you what happens when you do that. If you scale it out, now if you try to put your marker on that key, it's not on the key, it's on a fraction. So it's say if I use my greater than less than keys to step, it's at 92.68. So you don't want that. You want it to be on 90, 91, 92. Anyway, I'll undo that change. I would only use that in specific predicaments. Alright, so let's do some animation with the graph editor. So I'm just going to drag over these, shift drag over these, right click and just go delete. And that'll just delete the keys. Let's click this button to go back to the start of the playback range, frame 1. And let's select our box, should already be selected. And you can drag over all the translate and rotate values, release at the bottom, rotate Z, and then press 0 and enter. And that'll just bring us right back to 0. The scale, if you set it to 1, it'll go back to the original shape. Drag over all these and say 5, and enter, and it'll be 5 units tall, wide, and deep. Alright, so let's just bring it up to on top of the grid. Alright, so an easy way to change your panels, your panel view here, is you can go to panels and you can go to orthographic and see the front, side, or top. So you can do it that way. I'm going to go to the front. So we're looking at it down the Z perspective, and you can see in the corner of your panel here, you can see that the Y and the X are there, and then we're looking straight down the Z axis. You can also change the panels by hitting your space bar, and you get the entire menu set when you do that. But if you hit the space bar and you right click, you can change your orthographic views this way as well. So say I go to top and release my mouse button. We're now in the top view, and you can see it says top at the bottom of the panel here. At the bottom it says camera 1 in this panel. So we're just going to go back to the front, spacebar, and for this exercise we're just going to animate in the front view. If you don't like the camera in the way there, you can go to show. You can see we have everything checked, so it's showing everything. But all we have in here right now is a polygon cube and a camera, so that's all we can see. But if you go to and deselect the camera, you won't see any cameras. You can also put it on a display layer down here if you like. Alright, so let's animate this cube going in a circle. We're going to go for something like this. This is something I did earlier. So we're going to animate this in the graph editor. So this is the beginning of our workflow exercises. So the workflow I'm going to show you here in this class is going to be carried on throughout the entire program. What we basically do is we block our animation on the timeline down here, then we refine it in the graph editor. So let's go to frame 1. We're just going to animate this cube going in a circle. So we're going to block it in the timeline first. So you can set your keyframe on frame 1. Just select the cube and press S on your keyboard, and it sets a key on frame 1. So let's go to maybe frame 10. Go to frame 10, and you can just grab, you can do it this way, you can grab the Y and X translate manipulators. You can move it this way, or you can just grab the center. Because we're in the front view, it's not going to move it in Z at all, it's only moving it in X and Y. So we're just going to move it to about here, and we're just going to animate it all around the perimeter of this panel. So you can frame it, you can go into your camera view and just frame it so we can see the entire cube. We can see the whole entire area, because we're going to have it moving in a circle here. Alright, so on frame 10, we moved it to the side here. Let's just press S again. And we're just going to go every 10 frames. So let's go to frame 20. We'll just move it to the top here in the front view. Key it. Go to frame 30 in the timeline, S to key it. And then we'll go to frame 40. And we want it right back to its original spot. So we can move it there. Just to make sure that it's accurate and precise, we'll go to frame 1. We can copy that. Right click and copy, and then we'll go to frame 40, right click and paste. Go to paste, next window, and then select paste. So now if we drag over that, and we can see all of our keys in the graph editor there. So now if we drag over that, you can see that from our first keyframe to our second keyframe, it just moves in a very linear fashion. So actually we can play it. Just play it to see what happens. So it sort of moves in a diamond shape. Just going from one pose to the next, or one position to the next in a straight line. So what we want to do is we want to get this moving in a nice circle. So before we do that, I'm just going to quickly grab my range slider underneath the timeline here. I'm just going to grab the right side of it, just drag it, just scale it out so that my keys are filling the entire timeline. So now if you press play, if you have your playback range in your settings set to play continuously, it'll just keep playing that. So we're going to cycle this too at the end. To get this moving in a more circular fashion, we need to think about, okay, well, from our first pose to our second pose, it's moving in a linear fashion. What do we need to manipulate to get it to move in a curved, arcing path of action? Well, we need to manipulate the Y. It needs to dip down in Y a little bit here between these two keyframes. So let's go to our graph editor, select Y, I'm just going to drag this up a little so I can see it. So we're going to go in between these two keyframes. Select your second keyframe, and you can select the handle and just give it a little bit of a bend and see how that, you can bend it back and forth just to see the results in the front view. You can also see it in the camera view as well, but whichever panel is selected, you'll see the result happening. So we'll go to frame 1. So what we want it to do is we want it to sort of skid along the bottom here, and dip and go into an arcing motion. So go to the spot on the timeline where you want the change to happen. So in this case, it's right about in the middle. Go to your graph editor, select the second keyframe, select one of the handles on the side of it, and just give it a bend. And then you can see if we bend it this way, it dips down a little bit. So now if we drag over our animation to the timeline, we're going to get, this is more like what we want. Moves in an arcing motion. So by bending this, by fixing this side, you can see it bends the curve on both sides of the key. So it kind of fixed the other one too. The area in between these next two keyframes. It's moving in half a circle now. It's not moving in a straight line. The other side is still moving in a straight line, and you can see the difference between this side and that side. We want to do the same thing on this side. Just give it a little bit of a bend. So now we have it moving in a circular pattern. So let's just play that. Okay, so we have it moving in a circular pattern, but now it stops at our original spot. So we want to fix that. And that's really what it's all about when you animate something and then you watch it. You have to identify where the problems are. Any area that it doesn't look good or you're not happy with, identify where it is and then go into the graph editor and see what's going on. So we have to think about why that's happening. Well, it's not the y-axis that's causing that problem. It's the x-axis. So let's go to the translate x. Alright, so we don't want the cube to start off slow. We want it moving in a consistent circular motion, like the example. So we can see in the translate x curve, it starts off flat like this. If a curve is completely flat, it means there's no motion on it. If it starts off flat, that means it's going to start really slow. It's going to start with no motion and slowly start to move into a movement. But we're only looking at the translate x, so only this movement. So because it starts off flat, it's starting off slow. It's starting from a stop. So what we want to do is grab that first handle and bend it like this. So it immediately starts to move at a steady pace. And you can see this curve in the translate x that it's going up the curve is at a pretty steady incline. That means that it's going to move at a steady pace. But then it slowly starts to, because this tangent is flat, it's going to start to slow. But that's okay, it's only slowing in x. And then on the way down, because it's moving up, that means it's moving to the right. And then when you see this curve moving down, it's going to start to move to the left, which is what it's doing here. And then it comes to a slower stop here. So we don't want that slow stop to happen either. We want to make it constant so that it'll hook up with the first pose. So if you play that now, it should look pretty smooth. Okay, it's stopping because our timeline goes past our last keyframe. So there's no animation over here on these last two frames. Frame 40 and frame 1 are exactly the same. So we don't want it to play frame 40 because it'll stick for 2 frames. We want to set our timeline to stop at 39 so that after we see the animation on frame 39, it's going to immediately jump back to 1. We can do that by dragging the end of the range slider, or we can just type it in here, 39. We're only seeing up to frame 39. Alright, so if you play it now, it should be a pretty steady circular motion, and it is. You just zoom out in our camera view a little bit. So the next thing we're going to try is a figure 8. So here's the example. We're going to aim for something like that. Alright, so you can bring your range slider back out a little bit, and let's just delete. We'll leave frame 1, and we'll just delete all these other keys. So shift select over them, right click, and go to delete. So now our animation's gone. We'll change the position of the box. Let's bring it to the center here. This black line is going to be our floor. That represents the grid here. So let's bring it up here, and we'll just press S to set a key. And we're going to go around this panel in this direction. So we're going to start clockwise, and then we're going to go around in a figure 8 in this fashion here. So let's go to frame 10 again. Let's go 10 frames apart. Set a key on frame 10. Let's go to frame 20. Move it up to about there. Set a key. Go to frame 30 on our timeline. Just do this rough. It doesn't have to be really precise. And at this point, we're going to bring it down to back to the center again because we're working our way down to here, right? You could copy frame 1. I'll just move it there for now. You don't have to do that. Let's just keep going so we don't forget what we're doing. Frame 50, set a key. Frame 60, back up over here. Frame 70, up to the top, and then frame 80, back to our original position. At this point, I am going to copy frame 1 to our last keyframe, just so we have a perfect cycle, and there's not going to be any jumps at the end. So now if we play that, we can put this on frame 79 so that it doesn't play frame 80. Right after we see frame 79, it's going to jump right back to frame 1. So we'll type in 79 here, enter it. So now if we play that in the front view, you can play it in the camera view if you want to. It's not a very smooth movement. You can see it better here. It's sort of jumping around a little bit. It's jumping in the middle, and also it's just moving in these diamond shaped patterns. So we're going to round that off in a similar way that we did with the last exercise. Just like we did in the last exercise, the first thing we'll do is we'll fix our translate Y channel. So we can see it eases in right away. We'll just bend that so that it starts at a consistent pace right off the start. So again, looking in between the two first keyframes, we'll put our time marker right in the middle. Wherever your time marker is on the timeline is where it'll be in the graph editor. See this red line? And you'll see the affected change in between those two keyframes. So scrub over between the next two keys, moving in a straight line. We don't want that, so we're going to bend this so it eases in and out. Well, that gives us a bit of a bend. We'll do the same thing up here. And by bending this one, it bent the other side of this curve, the other section, so that's working out for us. Mind you too, don't forget you can also select the key and shift middle mouse button. You can move this up and down too if you like, just to get a better, more even curve. So by bending these curves and moving these up and down, you can get what you need. So you can see the pattern. We need these to be rounded at the top and at the bottom. So you can go ahead, go through your entire timeline, or all your translate Y keys, and just bend them so we get that one's okay, and this one we need to bend, and then it eases into a stop here, which we don't want. We want it to be consistent, just so you get something like this. You can highlight each panel just by selecting the upper area here, just in the gray area, whichever one you want to play it in. Alright, so we'll just play that. And that's looking pretty good. Alright, so let's look at our translate X. I'm thinking we're pretty much okay. Okay, so you want that straight. See how these keys are just not, they're kind of just shifted a little bit. You want to make sure that this entire animation curve in our translate X is perfectly straight, so that that whole section is this area here when it's going from the top of its figure 8 to this bottom here. You want that to be a consistent movement from left to right. You don't want it to slow down and speed up. So in order to have it consistent or constant, this should be a perfectly straight line. So you can slide these keys up a little or down a little, whatever you need to do, and then just bend them so the handles are in line with the animation curve. You can go full screen if you tap your spacebar. You can see more what I mean. It's just making sure they're all straight, so it's a totally consistent angle. If it's a consistent angle, it'll be a constant move. What you don't want is something like this happening. You don't want any kind of inconsistencies in that angle, because if you do, it'll look like this. And you can see an X that's just waving all over the place. That's because we have all these wavy animation curves. So you want that nice and straight. You want to make sure too that our ends are linear, meaning that they start moving at a constant, steady pace right off the bat. And we have our figure 8. Okay, so we were just working with the translate X and translate Y. If we start fooling around with the translate Z, we can get it moving forward and backward as well. If you select your translate Z and look in our graph editor, you can see that it's completely flat because it's not moving in Z at all. I'm just going to go to my perspective window. So you can see the Z axis is forward and backward. It's facing us. We'll just put it on a bit of an angle here. It's only animating in X and Y, so up and down and right and left. So you can grab these, select one of these, and shift middle mouse button, drag up or down, and you can get some X movement going on it. You can select two at a time, drag them up and down. If you do something like this, we'll just take two, put them up, two, put them down. And you can see now, if you turn it this way, you can see it's moving in. Not very much in Z. We'll just move it a little more. So if you go to the key that you're going to change, the graph editor, so you can see the change happen. And use your greater than less than keys to step from one key to the next. It's zipping all over the place in Z now. What we could do, if we don't want any of that action occurring, you can select one of these keyframes, or you can select as many as you want. If you go up to this text field here, whatever key you select, or however many you select, enter in 0 in this text field, it'll snap everything right back to 0 and get rid of all of your movements. But the keyframes are still there to be edited. Okay, so there's one other thing I wanted to explain to you guys. I just want to talk about the tangents in Maya. Okay, so let's go to our Y. In our graph editor, looking up at the top here, if you hover over this button here, it'll show you what it's called. It's called the Spline Tangent. And that just makes curves very smooth, like this animation curve is. It smooths out your curves, basically. We're not going to worry about this clamped one. We don't use that very much. Linear tangents make things straight. Flat tangents make your keys flat. So let's just take a quick look at what that does. When we're blocking out our animation, we want to block everything out in flat tangents, and then we're going to spline everything later and smooth it out. So we bent this curve earlier, but I'll just select that key, and we're going to press the flat tangent button just to see what it does. Okay, so notice the handles are now flat. The only way you can really tell the tangent is by looking at these handles. So you can see that I flattened it out. If I press the spline one, it makes it curvy. The linear one makes it straight. So if I go to this one and press linear, you can't really see the effect, but it basically does this for us. I always like to bend it manually myself to put it where I want it. But if this curve is flat and you select linear, you go to linear and hit that, it should make it more like a constant movement. If you select two of these and make them linear, it will be straight. It'll be completely straight from point A to point B. So that basically just gives you, it's called linear tangents, and it gives you a linear movement. If I select both these and I say flat, they'll both be flat, and what that does is it eases out of a movement and then eases into a movement. So if we know that a flat curve like that is no movement at all. There's also stepped, which we use. It can be used for lip sync, or it can be used for any other kind of movement where it just pops from keyframe to keyframe. Usually it's used, I see used a lot for camera cuts, and it looks like that. It just looks like literally a step. The object just pops from position to position like this. And we only have the Y set to stepped at the moment, so it's only stepping in Y. If I set both the X and the Y to stepped for these two keyframes, you'll see it'll just pop from position to position. So that's used for camera cuts, so the camera just pops from one position to another between cuts. Actually, I'll just set all these to spline, and we'll fix our curve back the way we had it. That's usually the workflow, is we block everything out in the timeline on flat tangents, and our Maya is already set to automatically set all of our keys to flat. And then what we do is we select everything, shift drag select it on the timeline, or we can go in the graph editor and select individual channels, or you can drag over all your channels and select all of them. However you select your keys and go up here and set them to spline. So we'll block everything out on the timeline with flat tangents, set all the keys to spline, and then we'll refine our curves from there. The other way you can change a tangent is to select one or more keyframes. Select that. Again, we can do it with these buttons up here, or you can right click right in the timeline, go to tangents, and they're all listed here as well. Spline, linear, clamped, stepped. But you'll learn more about that as we go along here. Alright, so that's it for Maya Basics 2. We'll see you in Basics 3.